Hello, and thank you for viewing. I'm delighted to talk with you today from my home in Scituate, Massachusetts, near Boston. And thank you to Dolores Meany and the County Clare Library for inviting me and for arranging all of the details needed to make this happen. My paternal grandparents, John Quealy and Bridget Meade Quealy, were both born in County Clare and lived there into early adulthood, eventually emigrating to the United States in the early 1900s and settling for a time in Lowell, Massachusetts. I remember my grandmother's Irish accent and Irish expressions and stories of Ireland, and I came to learn later about the difficulties and hardships confronting my grandmother and her Meade family in Ireland at a time when Britain still ruled that country very harshly. I wanted for many years to discover all that I could about why she left a beloved homeland, along with so many others, and about the struggles of the family she left behind. I set out to find that story, and it is written out in my book, Reflections of an Irish Grandson, a story of grandmother Bridget Meade Quealy and the Meade family of Miltown Malbay, County Clare, Ireland. It is sure that I took from my grandparents a true and real love for Ireland, and I always find great joy in returning, which I've done many times over the years. I'll be back in June, this time with my 5 young grandchildren, and I couldn't be more excited than to be with them on their first visit to Ireland. I'll read a series of excerpts from the book, and after the first few minutes taken from the early chapters, I'll focus special attention on the terror of the Canada Cross shootings in Miltown Malbay as we mark the anniversary, April 14, 1920, of that frightful event. The readings in total take only about 20 to 25 minutes. The first chapter takes its theme from a beautiful phrase written by William Butler Yeats. My children may find here deep-rooted things. And so, chapter 1, Deep-Rooted Things, Miltown Malbay, County Clare, Ireland. The town is little noticed by tourists to County Clare. It is a town, rather, quite undisturbed by the pace of the world, still home to lifelong residents, most known to one another, and most of familiar surnames: Quealy, Meade, Curtin, Conway, Hennessy, Burke, Maguire, Karen, Frawley, Hennessy, Malone, and more. I recently came to learn a bit more about this long-standing intimacy among the townspeople of Miltown Malbay, evident even now. While planning a June 2022 meeting with cousin Pat Meade in Miltown, I telephoned Peter Meade, Pat's brother in Westwood, Massachusetts, to ask about how best to reach Pat. Peter remarked that I only need to get to town and ask for Pat. Amused and charmed by the thought, I nevertheless requested Pat's telephone number. I visited with Pat Meade in Miltown Malbay in June 2022, as we had earlier that spring agreed to spend some time in discussing and supplementing my family research. We arranged to meet in the parking lot of the Super Value store, just a block behind the Main Street shops, on Tuesday, June 7th. He arrived precisely at the time we had discussed, 10:15 a.m. We'd talked by telephone a couple of times before my arrival on this date in Miltown Malbay, and were prepared for a day spent together, reviewing places and sites of importance to the Meade family story, and especially to the story of 3 Meade brothers, his dad, Joe, and his uncles, Peter and Jim, each of whom served courageously in the IRA's Mid-Clare Brigade during the Irish War of Independence. Pat knew much about the family's history and about events during that period. Pat took a great interest in my research and in the detail which I'd compiled, adding many insights and observations as we drove throughout the Miltown Malbay area that day. He'd known principals in the story of the IRA's Mid-Clare Brigade, Patrick Karen, Anthony Malone, Martin Frawley, and others, in their later years, and spoke of them knowledgeably and with real admiration. He was very generous with his time, not hurried nor even aware, it seemed, of the many hours already spent together on that June day. Sometime around 3:30 or maybe 4 p.m., I said to Pat that I was very appreciative of the time he'd afforded me and did not wish to impose any longer. Pat shook his head, dismissing the thought. I've nothing to do and all day to do it, he told me. The humor is genuine and authentic to the Irish personality, to Pat Meade's personality, underlying a kind and generous nature, unwilling to hint at any inconvenience to himself, and glad to accommodate my agenda. I had, in fact, arrived in Miltown Malbay on the morning of my meeting with Pat Meade much earlier than necessary, planning to spend a bit of time making notes and crafting a few essential questions for the day while enjoying some coffee and perhaps a local bakery treat. I found myself, however, unable to locate a bakery or a coffee shop open before 10 a.m. Noticing an older gentleman walking toward me, I asked if he might direct me to a shop or cafe. Oh, he replied, not in this town now, not before 10 o'clock. It's a small town, you know. But, he continued, walk with me now while I get my paper just there, and they'll have a takeaway. We walked along a short distance, the older gentleman telling me that he was born in this town, in that blue house, pointing ahead. I introduced myself and told him that I was here this morning to meet with my cousin, Pat Meade. Astonished, he stopped walking, looking at me directly now with an air of excited discovery. Well, I'm your cousin too. I'm Chrissy Curtin. Pat Meade's mother is Mary Curtin Meade. I remembered then Peter's instruction to me of a few months earlier, as he'd insisted that it's only necessary to get to town and ask for Pat. So it is in Miltown Malbay. Deep-rooted things, indeed. Chapter 2, First Memories. I knew from my very first childhood memories that I was Irish and that I was surrounded by Irish relatives, my paternal grandparents, both of whom emigrated to the U.S. in their early adulthood, aunts, uncles, and an ever-present cousin, Eileen Meade. It was almost never my father who made any clear mention of Ireland, but my paternal grandmother, Bridget Meade, who made it most plain, as she still spoke in a very strong and a very unmistakable Irish accent. She was born to a tenant farmer in County Clare, Ireland, and lived her early life, as most poor Irish Catholics did at the time, under harsh and repressive conditions of Protestant and Anglo-Irish landlords and the rule of the Royal Irish Constabulary. I have clear and sharp memories of my grandmother throughout my childhood, as I would accompany my father on most Saturdays to visit her in her Brookline apartment. She held to many old Irish expressions of speech, often greeting me by declaring, "Well, isn't it himself?" The apartment was thick with Irish lace placed on various tables, and I remember old and withering palms, saved from Palm Sunday, stuck behind a crucifix. I remember a few shillelaghs in the apartment, and was told that they were very helpful as an aid in walking around the Irish countryside. I was given a shillelagh as a gift on a couple of different occasions, though I don't remember exactly if those occasions were birthdays or Christmas or maybe First Communion. And I still sing an old Irish lullaby, Tora Lora Lora, to my grandchildren, that lilting and soothing lyric I first learned at the knee of Bridget Meade. Chapter 4, Bridget's Voyage. Bridget Meade was born in Miltown Malbay, County Clare, Ireland, on October 3rd, 1888, one of 14 children of Peter and Ellen Meade. She lived her childhood and adolescent years, even into her early adulthood, on the 10-acre farm which the family then occupied as tenant farmers. Many millions of Irish had, sadly, found it necessary to leave their homes and their homeland, as oppression, penal laws, famine, rack rents, anti-Catholicism, and more beset them for centuries. Bridget found herself now numbered among them by 1909, departing her home, her family, her native land, and sailing on the SS Saxonia from Queenstown, Ireland, in that sorrowful year. The big ship left its berth on June 2nd, steering a true and steady course for America, but for many aboard, for Bridget Meade, steering as well toward an unclear and an uncertain future. It is a measure of how entirely the British set about purging Ireland, not only of its land and of its resources, but of its language and of its history and of its culture, that the very harbor from which Bridget Meade sailed in 1909 was known then as Queenstown. It had long been known actually as Cove, its Irish name, and was a sleepy little fishing village at the southern edge of County Cork near the River Lee. It was the potato famine, the Great Hunger, that changed the story of Cove. The potato blight and resulting famine struck in 1845, and between then and 1849, over 2.5 million desperate Irish emigrants found passage from Cove Harbour on hundreds of sailing ships and steamers bound for America. The conditions aboard often seemed hardly better than conditions in the Irish countryside, and many died en route from rampant disease. The ships carrying Ireland's poorest sons and daughters soon became known as coffin ships, and Cove Harbour as the Harbour of Tears. And yet, in 1849, while Cove Harbour was still the key port of departure for so many suffering Irish, the British cheerily renamed this port of Irish grief Queenstown, in honor of Queen Victoria's visit there. Bridget Meade is listed on the passenger manifest of the SS Saxonia as having departed from Queenstown, though it is sure that she departed from the Harbour of Tears. A final irony, however, remains in that the HMS Titanic, the unsinkable pride of British shipbuilding and symbol of the Empire's maritime preeminence, left Queenstown, left Ireland's Cove Harbour as its last port of call before heading across the Atlantic for its maiden voyage on April 11th, 1912. A young Bridget Meade arrived alone in Boston on June 10th, 1909, no doubt anxious and unsure about what awaited her in this distant and unfamiliar land. She was far from all that she had known, far from all that she had cherished, and still quite unwelcome in this new place, which had very little regard for poor and Catholic Irish immigrants. "The worst misfortune which ever happened to the United States," said Mr. Arthur Crew Inman of Boston's Old Brahmin Society, "is the Irish." Her life had changed utterly. She was 20 years old. Chapter 6. Three Brothers' Bravery and the British. The Irish War of Independence came harshly to Miltown Malbay. Though Bridget was now far and safely removed from its dangers, residents of the small town in the west of Clare, where she had lived until only a few years prior, would soon suffer its scourge. Bridget's family, the Meade family, would come to know particular hardship and sorrow. The 1918 elections, in which Sinn Féin won a large majority of seats in Parliament, proved, of course, to be the seminal moment in the struggle to gain independence from Britain. And it was in the Meade household that many local election planning meetings had taken place. It is in this, my house, that all the Republicans meet every night to plan out everything. Everything was planned for every election, even the county election, and they appoint one for every district to go around the day before to tell the old people to be ready when they come for them in the morning. Joe, Bridget's brother, does that as far as Killinan and all the way round to Miltown until 9 o'clock at night, and then they go to Ennis with the boxes, fearing anything would happen, and stay overnight in Ennis, recalled Ellen Meade some years later. Also writing that Joe worked hard at the elections, bringing voters to the booths every time. If Republicanism had taken root in County Clare, it flourished in Miltown Malbay. It was, though, increasingly dangerous to engage in such activities, considered by the British as treasonous, and surely likely to invite very intimidating surveillance and ruthless discipline. "I could be writing forever about all we have gone through here during the Troubles," reads one letter of Ellen Meade, "so often raided, as they had to pass here and always watched us." Great Britain emerged from the long and ugly struggle of World War I as the preeminent military power on earth, still able to proclaim both that Britannia rules the waves and that the sun never sets on the British Empire. The armistice had been agreed to in November of 1918, and Britain and its allies had won a decisive and fulsome victory. The British could now attend, uninterrupted, to the Irish problem. Beginning in early 1919, Miltown Malbay was designated by the British as a military area, and the Royal Irish Constabulary in the town had been reinforced by British Army regulars. The district was subject to all the objectionable restrictions associated with military rules. Fairs and meetings were banned. Movements of persons into and outside the area was allowed only on the production of a permit from the sergeants of the Royal Irish Constabulary. Barracks were erected on the roads at different points in the area at which sentries were posted, who questioned and searched pedestrians and passengers in carts and motor cars. The British at war's end were both able and willing to train all the resources of a modern, highly equipped military, including land and naval forces, on the task of finally subjugating these troublesome Irish. Regular British Army troops and the infamous Black and Tans arrived in Ireland, battle-tested from fighting on the continent, and ready to take up arms again in assisting the Royal Irish Constabulary in the aim of destroying Irish hopes for independence. Barracks across Ireland were now filled with experienced and well-armed and well-trained soldiers, all arrayed against a citizen army of volunteers. The Irish Volunteers, now to be known as the Irish Republican Army, was not an army at all. The IRA had yet no functioning government or state able to fund them or to equip them or to train them, but neither could any state nor any government nor any hostile force deter them from a rigid determination to find themselves freed from century-long suffering and oppression. It was necessary to rely on sympathetic and supportive Irish Americans for money and for arms, smuggled into Ireland at great risk. Germany, too, had earlier assisted the nascent IRA in providing rifles and ammunition, hoping to weaken the English as an adversary. While British forces could rely upon the use of every implement of modern warfare, tanks, artillery, gunboats, armored carriers, machine guns, mortars, incendiaries, the IRA relied exclusively on guerrilla warfare tactics, raiding barracks for weapons, trains and depots for ammunition, hindering British troop movements by blocking roadways with debris or by digging ditches, and ambushing British troops along rural country roads where the terrain and routes of escape were familiar. Tensions were high across the whole of Ireland, and surely so in Miltown Malbay. Expressions of disdain and contempt for British occupiers were common and rarely disguised. The ill will displayed towards Crown forces was returned plenty to the citizens of this little town in County Clare. A deadly confrontation would soon result. British authorities in January 1920 arrested a large number of prominent Republicans and remanded them to Mountjoy Prison. The prisoners, led by Tom Hunter, Frank Gallagher, and Peter Clancy, decided on a hunger strike as a means of protesting their unjust incarceration. The hunger strike and the harsh treatment of the prisoners gained widespread scorn. Political pressure arising from wholesale public anger eventually persuaded the British to release the prisoners. The news was celebrated across the country, unfortunately so in Miltown Malbay. Residents in town, learning the news of the end of the hunger strike and of the release of the Irish political prisoners from Mountjoy Prison, gathered spontaneously on the evening of April 14, 1920, in a location at the town center called Canada Cross. Canada Cross is the intersection of Ballard Road, Main Street, and Estymon Road, and Church Street. The place had taken its name in honor of a raid by bold Fenian men who crossed the border from America into Canada in 1866 to raid for arms from the British. The crowd was jubilant, the celebration festive, the emotion heartfelt, and as the evening progressed, a large tar barrel was set in the center of the intersection and set alight while the crowd sang patriotic songs. One witness described the crowd. They were good-humored and were singing songs, orderly, and in no way truculent towards anybody. Sometime near 10:45 p.m., fearing that any large gathering in Miltown Malbay could result in public disorder or disruption, forces of the Royal Irish Constabulary arrived on the scene and quickly surrounded the crowd. The sergeant called on the townspeople to disperse, and soldiers immediately opened fire. Opened fire on a crowd of unarmed civilians. Opened fire on a crowd of men, women, and children, opened fire on a crowd of Irish persons, no less in 1920 citizens of the United Kingdom than would be a crowd gathered in the center of London. 3 Miltown Malbay men, Patrick Hennessy, age 30 and father of 2, John O'Loughlin, age 25, and Timothy O'Leary, age 38, father of 10 children, were struck by the soldiers' bullets and died in the street. Scores of others were wounded and injured, including 2 school children, Thomas Reedy and Nonnie Donlin, both under 15 years of age. It is remarkable and chilling to consider that, as the Meade family was so connected to the movement for Irish independence, and that young Meade brothers, Joe, Jim, and Peter, were then serving in the Mid-Clare Brigade, it is very likely that Meades were among the celebrants, were among those terrified citizens on that tragic and frightening evening in April 1920. The Most Reverend Michael Fogarty, Bishop of Killaloe, expressing both his sorrow and his outrage at the shootings, addressed residents of the town only a few days later. "My poor people," the bishop said, "they have made a Calvary of your little square, but what was meant for a massacre has become a consecration." While an inquest was organized by British authorities to investigate the shootings at Canada Cross, predictably, no punitive actions were taken against any participating members of the Royal Irish Constabulary. And worse, that terrible incident would not be a singular outburst of British anger at the townspeople of Miltown Malbay, but only foreshadowed greater and more deadly trouble to come. Thank you all for your attention and for your interest in this story. I'll look forward to future opportunities to read a bit more from my book and, of course, to returning to Ireland early this summer. James Joyce, the celebrated and brilliant Irish novelist, once described his emotions on returning to Ireland from his home in Paris, where he'd been immersed in the artist community there. And I always feel that it fits brilliantly for me. My heart is quite calm now. I will go back.